I'm Dan. I'm a librarian and community archivist at Grunt Gallery, which is an artist-run center in a similar model to Vivo. Here, it's located in Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Vancouver on unceded Coast Salish, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about accessibility work that we've done in our archive in the context of our digital database project. I'll begin before that with just a few of the key principles that underline the access work that we do. And the first of these begins with a bit of a disclaimer, and that is that I do not have a disability. So while I'm going to talk about access today and some of the specific things that we do to better serve folks, I just want to qualify my comments and remind us all to listen to people with lived experiences. People are experts on their own bodies and brains, and if we're so lucky to learn from them, I decided to make a slide of some of my teachers. There's a glaring omission here of the wonderful artist and human being, Cyrus Marcus Ware, but I think that, oh yeah, thank you. I think that acknowledging where we're learning from is super important. The second principle is one around universal access. We regard it as a myth or maybe at the very least, a very unlikely proposition. Sometimes people's access needs conflict directly with one another, but fortunately, there's more than one way of doing things. And so the irony is not lost on me that in a presentation talking about image descriptions, I've described none of these images. If you'd like to email me, I'd be happy to send you a set of image descriptions and some notes on how the pictures map to the presentation. Accessibility is a continuous non-linear process. This type of work, it's much like archival work. It's never done, and it requires continuous labor and funding. And so given that, the sustainability of our work as arts workers, information workers, and anybody else doing this type of work also represents an access need and should be given care accordingly. So we embrace slowness in our work. Bodies have value, and people are more than just their bodies. We understand bodies, disabled bodies, as that can be radical sites of radical resistance against ableism, and that these struggles intersect with many other struggles, including racism, struggles against capitalism, gender and sexual discrimination, and so on and so on. We don't measure our success by the presence of specific audiences. We're not into building it for them to come. We're not into those type of metrics, but rather we succeed by working toward a basic reality where the widest possible audience is supported in their access needs. And also we document and attempt to share whenever possible. So if something is working well for us, we want to support it in working well for you as well. Our work in the archive is framed in a larger initiative at Grunt, AEPE, or the Accessible Exhibitions, Programs, and Events Initiative/Department. This is led by Kay Slater, who originally was our preparator and is now our kind of spiritual leader when it comes to access work, who is a queer hard of hearing artist, as well as our former program director, Vanessa Kwan, who's really instrumental in just kind of like assigning leadership and funding and everything that this type of initiative needs to get off the ground and move away from being a checklist. We started this in 2020, and it really started to become accelerated as the pandemic got more serious. And I think for a lot of people, broader swaths of society started to encounter the type of barriers that people in the disabled community have been encountering and talking about for years. And so it was a really eye-opening moment for so many people. And this is really a set of cross-organizational activities that are really too numerous to name here. I'll probably run out of time if I did so. But we do things like offer a low sensory exhibition opening hour or visiting hours. There's voice off, reduced sense. In some cases, no alcohol, masks mandatory. It's very adjustable depending on the scene or on the situation. We do non-auditory and tactile artist residencies. We do opt-in stipends in our contracts for our exhibiting artists who want to participate in accessibility work. So if they want to design and produce tactile objects for our visitors, if they want to record exhibition audio tours, they want to describe their works in such ways that more people can enjoy them. For event hosting, of course, we offer hybrid, streamed, and live. There's some excellent discussion with Kate and Michelle around Zoom and streaming events as being a more comfortable and more accessible form, despite the kind of general consensus that we're all tired of those things. They're the bread and butter for the way many people interface with the world and have been for a long time. Physical upgrades like automatic doors and signage and labels. It's made its way into our communications. So we're an art gallery. We love art speak. We hate art speak. we want plain language. We want image descriptions in our social media. We want captions in our videos, that sort of thing. Our staff and meeting culture, the way we meet, we practice doing descriptions of ourselves, visual descriptions. We identify ourselves as speakers, and we mic check when we're done, all that sort of thing. And many, many more things, including archives, which is why we're here to talk about today. But I really wanted to kind of just name some of those other things to show how this is not a discrete area that we work in, but rather a much more holistic way of doing things. And yeah, these access considerations exist in everything we do every day, all the time, which can be super overwhelming to approach. But we're very fortunate to have leadership that understands this and commits resources to support what we do. But we're also Artist Run Center, nonprofit. We understand the realities of those situations. So we also fully support doing what you can with what you have. And that's what a lot of this is about. Yeah, so starting with access in the archives. Geez, this was new work to me a few years ago, but there's lots of parallels with archival work. It's a massive and unending workload. There's slow, detail-oriented process. This is often invisible or underused labor that resurfaces after years in meaningful ways. So yeah, many of us already have a great mindset for this because we already do this, and we already used to working under these conditions. We wanted to start with enactable measures that we could take on rather than feeling overwhelmed by how much there was to do. So the first thing we undertook was captioning and transcription of the videos in our archives, which date from the late 80s. We have about 500 tapes. Fortunately, a majority of them have been digitized through various efforts over the last 10 years. So yeah, developing workflows around how to do that, how to train others to do it. We use otter.ai to do our transcription work. We edit the transcriptions, we go through, we look for specialized language, dated language, harmful language, that sort of thing. We output them in PDF, but we also output them in plain text formats, which are generally the most accessible. And creating subtitles, we use a web-based program called amara.org to make our VTT and SRT files. And so, yeah, then how do we enhance these through some of the principles I was talking about, namely the co-learning aspect? We've done a free workshop series on how other organizations can do this type of work, doing captioning and transcription, as well as specialized workshops for arts professionals, arts students, people working in performance or literary events, and other community members. We want to support our staff and our contractors and peers in making their videos more accessible, but also skilling them up for wherever they might find themselves working and doing this type of thing in the future. And we want to have dialogues on the tools that are available, pros and cons of auto captioning that is part of so many different platforms. We created an evergreen pre-recorded workshop that is freely available online, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, this is where we really come to this kind of practice of creative access as we moved from transcription, which of course is very literal kind of translation of a document from one sensory form to another, into image description. And creative access is an understanding of access work as a creative practice, as an art form in of itself. It can be highly subjective. Two people look at an image and give it 200 words, and you'll get two very different things. So we want to respect best practices, but we also want to allow for that expressive space and to use this as a means of resisting top-down accessibility initiatives. Accessibility initiatives are led by non-disabled people and that sort of thing. This kind of work can be artistically stimulating. It can be enjoyable. It can be fun. Who would have thought? The familiar example of this that some may know is the Alt Text as Poetry project by Bojana Cochliat and Shannon Finnegan. And if you haven't seen that, I would definitely encourage you to check that out online. So we apply this kind of principle to writing image descriptions for images of the exhibitions and performances, gatherings, et cetera, in our archive, as well as videos. Developing these kind of best practices in terms of organizing our thoughts, avoiding harmful or ableist language in our description, and also not making them go on forever and ever, which is a real temptation when you're describing something, and allowing for the personal style of the person writing. This labor was initially a student volunteer. I don't really want to get into volunteer work in the arts. It's got a lot of baggage, but I'll just say I'm happy to say that in the last couple of months, I have secured about 15 grand in wages for our former volunteer to become our employee. So I'm over volunteering in the arts. And the output, of course, is a slow accumulation of these descriptions to upload to our database. So this project, 2021 to 2024, approximately, 3-year build of the collective access platform for ourselves and our friends at Vivo Media Arts, which is foregrounded by work done by our peers at Western Front, the Belkin Gallery at UBC, and the Dialogue Center on Indian Residential Schools at UBC, who did a similar collaborative project. So yeah, respect to them for showing us the way. Our archive, of course, collects documentation of artist-run programming in our space for 40 years and includes hundreds of records for exhibitions and projects, performances, thousands of records for individual artists and curators, and thousands, of course, image, document, audio, and video objects. So this 3-year project engaged tons of people, and we also engaged our own Kay Slater, who I mentioned earlier, as an accessibility consultant to create reports for us, including a report on the back end of the system. I mean, we focus on front end users or end users, so to speak, so much in these type of projects, but disabled people manage content too. So we wanted to look at the system underneath the system and like what can be done to improve it. Of course, there's sometimes less wiggle room than we're talking about building a front-facing website here. But we found that they were actually really responsive, and in the spirit of co-learning, it was important to let them know where the pain points are in the system. We learned so much. I don't know what to say. I mean, bringing our sites up to WCAG 2.1 AA target, and also thinking about the experience of people who use screen readers, tab navigations, keyboard traps, all this kind of thing, the browsing experience, everything from the fonts and the colors and the contrast and all that stuff. Some things are very subtle. You know, you think about the use of italics and how a screen reader might encounter that using a rich text editor that assigns emphasis tags versus italic tags. And it's not going to make the difference between inaccessibility, but it sure would be annoying to hear the emphasized tags all the time. So these are things that are invisible to me in so many ways, but they still matter and we still change them. Compromise is inevitable. We love our carousels, right? Anybody who has a digital, we love our carousels. Some of us love infinite scroll, but these things can be like extremely frustrating for certain users. So in some cases, we keep those things. We just make sure that there's enough tags to let people know what they're getting into, and so they don't fall into those keyboard traps. So yeah, and accessibility, we consider it as a facet of our collection. So we had our designers add facets for those, and you can filter down by objects that have these attached. And it's looking at the numbers behind those. See, they don't have the actual numbers, but at one time they did, and it's just like a really good like scorecard for how much we're getting done. It's like a fire somewhere lit somewhere. Yeah, we learned good developers will work with you. Shout out to Whirligig. They changed so much for us. They changed allowable file formats. They added fields. They got rid of fields. They run scripts to change those kind of tags. They removed all sorts of links and stuff that we didn't want. Yeah, that was really a really good experience to work with. Yeah, so our site's now live, but our work continues. It's a work in progress, both in the information sense and in the access sense. We're responding to feedback around the site, and we've created a series. There's a screenshot here of the first in a series of 4 videos that's come out that includes audio description, picture-in-picture ASL on how to use the site, just as a means of making it from the get-go introduced in a way that we hope that will be easier for folks and not harder. So I'll just wrap it up. Money, right? Like, how do you pay for all this? I'm now a firm believer in incorporating access into every project you do. The earlier, the better. The more thoughtful you are, the better. It just doesn't work if it's an afterthought. So I put it in every grant, and the rationale for so many of the grants that we write for digital archives is making collections more accessible. But I think they're thinking of that in a different language, but the rationale exists. So we just kind of like leverage that as much as possible. I would recommend talking to your grant officers if they're not saying they'll fund this kind of thing. Oftentimes they can be convinced of this. The worst they can say is like no or maybe not. But these conversations demonstrate to them in the longer term the interest in this type of work. And if enough people keep saying this, they're eventually forced to listen. And especially forced to listen by the Federal Accessible Canada Act, passed in limited capacity in 2018 for our folks from down south. This is basically our ADA. And the goal is a barrier-free Canada by 2040. So really, it reflects very well on them to fund this type of work. And there's legislation behind that you can use to kind of make your point. Yeah, just a few of the grant examples up here. The Canada Council funded our site through digital strategies. We've recently tapped into digital generator funds to employ accessibility consultants looking at our sites. The LAC, Library Archives Canada Documentary Heritage Communities Program, which is one that I think a lot of folks will be familiar with. I've secured wages for this type of work a couple of times from that. So I think that's a good one to note if you write that grant. If you're more local to here, the Arts Touring Grant has a new stream, translation. It's translation and digitization of works. We consider writing captions and making captions a form of translation, and we were successful with that rationale this year. So I would encourage others to go that way if that's what you want to do too. It's not a traditional funding source for me in the archive, but if they keep that stream, it is now. And the IKB, a lot of us write the Irving K. Barber Learning Center. Love that grant. BC History Digitization, or if you're in your local region, perhaps there's something equivalent. I mentioned it to them this year when talking about a project. They said a lot of people are talking about that, so I'm encouraged that more can be done in that department, and they're hearing us slowly but surely. And yeah, it'll be great to see what comes. So yeah, I think I'll wrap it up there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Dan. Lots to talk about. And also, it'll be interesting in our conversation to maybe share some different regional experiences and different kinds of archives and how they're addressing issues of accessibility and inclusion. So it's great. We actually have really decent time for Q&A and conversation. So Dan and Elizabeth, do you want to come up and sit here, and I will help to traffic direct as questions come up. Also, there hopefully will be some questions also coming in from Zoom from those.
So we actually have 3 online that are all for Dan, and they are all interested in the creative access image description. So I'm going to try to pull them together into one succinct question, and you can respond. So what are the Grunt Gallery's practices or guidelines for generating the creative access description, including how to deal with the offensive or outdated language? And is it just the job of one person to write these, or is it many?
Thanks, Sydney. Yeah, so we have kind of like an object context idea type of approach, and which is really kind of thinking about the main idea and what's important in the image. There's kind of a slippery slope of course, like describing the essential qualities of the image and then leaving things out or describing too much. As sighted folks, we have the luxury of seeing everything and deciding what's important, but that's not afforded to everyone. So I kind of try to suggest people to cap them around 200 words, which is a pretty meaty thing to read about. But also I want people to engage. I think of it as a form of engagement with the images in our collection. And I might spend a lot of time looking at a particular image, maybe as long as it would take me to write that. Many people are doing them. Only a couple people are getting paid to do them right now. So I really try and restrict it to that for some of the aforementioned reasons that I thought, but many people have done them, and they are practiced like across our organization. So we have communication staff that would do them for, say, a social media post that we would do, or myself or my assistant doing them for something in the archive. So yeah, with the idea of creative access comes just like an opportunity to honor the subjectivity of what we see in the images, and to know that you're never going to have a perfect image description that is going to convey exactly what that image is to 100% of the people who encounter it. So just lean into the variance there. I think that answers it.
Thank you. My question is also for you, Dan, and I'm sorry if I already asked this to you, but maybe we'll just continue. So I'm really interested in how you deal, or maybe don't deal, with the copyright aspects of particularly the video works and adding subtitles and captions. And the reason why I'm asking that is because that's like the sticking point in the Copyright Act, where all other formats of material can be allowed through fair dealing exceptions to be like reformatted or whatnot for accessibility except cinematographic works. So yeah, how do you deal or not deal, and maybe it's a conscious decision to like just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, it's sort of a no deal kind of thing. I mean, I don't know, just more generally, like our approach to copyright is one that's very much intermingled and interbalanced with consent. We realize that the folks who legally hold copyright to material in our archive, which includes ourselves, but also includes the long list of photographers and videographers that we've worked with over the years, some living, some not, some accessible to us, some not. We're more interested in consent as an ongoing practice. It's something that Michelle brought up, and I think that having the opportunity to opt in or out of that ongoing as opposed to just once, to me it's more respectful and more valuable of the work. In terms of the legal copyright, I guess like I'd rather ask for forgiveness than permission when it came to that, because I really feel like what we're doing is in the spirit of making the work more accessible to people. So, cinematic film thing or documentation of video art, it's actually kind of interesting to talk about, documentation of performance art is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, because the art form in of itself is ephemeral and not containable, but the video is often expected to stand in for the document. Is it documentation or is it the work itself? Depending on how you look at it, it may or may not be those things. So I don't always look at it necessarily as, oh, this is a piece of, cinema, or this video is produced as a final artwork. It could just be the video of that. So it's not something I've given a lot of thought about, full disclosure. And also like, I'm waiting for somebody. Yeah. I would be super interested to hear about other people's means of navigating that. I think especially like folks like Kay, who've kind of taught us this, they're very much like in that section of the Venn diagram with the disability community and the techno-pagans, the copy left, that sort of thing. Like, I think this information wants to be out there in a way, and who am I to stand in its way? And I also realized I forgot part of the question from Sydney, which is about dealing with harmful language in the descriptions. We try and have some oversight. I mean, there's like when you're writing text to describe what can be seen in an image, there's a trap of talking about what you can see in the image, and it's like not everybody can see the image, So it's those kind of things that I feel like once you're aware of them, we can move along from them pretty quick. I think that's also part of the creative aspect of it, is how do we get around that? How do we describe things in such a way, sometimes created in very different contexts, older contexts in which language and behaviors and whatnot that are no longer considered acceptable were totally seem fine to people. So part of the artistic component of creative access is finding cool ways to work around that, still conveying the information, but also more importantly, being respectful. Thanks.
I know Sarah Beth Seymour is speaking tomorrow about some of the work with the Internet Archive and also a really massive archival reassembly project that she's part of leading. So actually, I'm going to throw this to you for tomorrow a little bit to pick up a bit. And I know that we've got colleagues from Artist Run Centers here also who are probably grappling with some of this as well. So I think it's a great kind of continuous conversation. Over to you.
Hi. Oh, okay. I'm Michael. I'm part of the project that is building a database of databases of like a catalog of existing research in Canadian arts and cultural sector. And my question is very simple. In your presentation, you mentioned that like the importance of like finding funding and like some of the problems in that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what kind of process, like what kind of step you went through to find these resources, and what kind of sort of friction, like what kind of problem did you encounter while you're looking for these funding opportunities? Yes.
You want to jump on? Okay. Thanks for the questions. Good one. Very practical. Yeah. So as a nonprofit non-commercial art space, like grants are our lifeblood for doing everything. So even just kind of becoming more a part of the organization. I started working at Grunt as a student in the iSchool actually. And yeah, I just like learned from very excellent grant writers and like these people who just know how to sniff out money and to just kind of like keep their ear to the ground. Um, our grant writer, Marianne Anderson, runs a website with a calendar that you can look on to find these kind of things. But we're just used to working in that system. And honestly, I would say it's like this community here. There's so many people in this room that I've been fortunate to learn from and to see the projects that they do. It's paying attention to projects that come online and seeing like going all the way to the end of the credits, you know, and seeing like where those logos are and like what is that program and kind of just like keeping in touch with that. I think especially here in Canada, it's thinking about different levels of government. It's thinking about funding sources that for all of our American friends, like foundations and private funding sources may or may not be applicable in a given situation. And it's also failing. Like I was like humble bragging about a bunch of grants that we got and money and whatnot, but we also don't get them from time to time. And it's like not getting them and calling the officer, like, why didn't I get this? You know, what can I do better next time? And how are we going to get this next time? So those are all my kind of general strategies. But I think, yeah, there's lots of experts in this room too. So spread that question around. I'll just add that I really like appreciate what you said. The like silos of funding streams have been a thing for so long that like, oh, we can't write these arts grants for our archive and vice versa. But they're kind of starting to break down. I noticed there's like a permeability that didn't exist 5 years ago in those, and that's great. But then it's also like sometimes we're like a bunch of dogs over the same bone, you know, like when it comes around.
So I can't help but jump into this question because I think we're seeing a kind of retraction of funding at the Canada Council and heritage level in Canada. I think we're going to have to work very closely across the SSHRC-funded archival research spaces that also struggle to get funding for technology, research and innovation. This is a Canadian comment, Americans forgive me, but I think it can be drawn across with NSERC type engineering grants that are looking at the next generation of these kinds of practices, including there is a strong focus in some of the funding from NSERC is our Engineering and Science Research Council with community partnered or led initiatives that have not-for-profits as part or at the table in order to take some of this work forward, because SSHRC now assumes that it's part of what happens in a grant. And they also won't fund digital humanities technology projects where that's the lead objective. So I think we're kind of caught in a tough space. And I think we need to go across the hallway and talk to people who are in the computer science and engineering spaces, because this is really intriguing, quite challenging work. And I think that there is some possibility there. So I'm just sort of throwing that out as we continue to worry about the funding issues. Sydney, you have a speaker I'd like to ask. Yes.
I can do a really quick question/comment, and then throw it your way. So in my role, I work for the AABC as the Education and Advisory Services Coordinator. So that's a question I get a lot about funding, and the BC government just doesn't like the archives world because we don't talk about ourselves enough on our soapbox. So, you know, museum projects or bigger projects, or everyone knows what that is, what the work entails. And so I find, right, it's the hustle culture. You're constantly hustling for money to get funding for those great students. But I like that you pointed out, Elizabeth, right? It's the reading between the lines of grant applications and what does that mean? Anything that says administration, I'm like, that's archival processing work, ladies and gentlemen, to bring people in to set up your archives program, because we used to get money for supplies and processing and people, and now digitization is sexy. So it's hard to get money for the work we need to do before we can digitize. So it's partnering, it's looking for those relationships, it's going outside the usual suspects, because small organizations don't have the capacity for a SSHRC application, but partnering and leveraging your skills and your network is a great opportunity. And then looking at maybe those organizations within that larger heritage or arts umbrella, and your application might not be terribly exciting to you, but to one of those other grant opportunities, they're like, wow, like we could support this part of the larger industry. Like, it's a neat thing to explore. But also you're right, frustrating if you don't get it. Like, don't just walk away with your head down and your tail tucked in. Like, hey, like, what can we do stronger? Why wasn't this successful? What can we work on next time to leverage? Because a lot of work goes into those sometimes unsuccessful applications, right? So build on it for next year. Try to rally. But yeah, it's a tough place to be because we could all use more money, but that cycle is tough within sort of the larger heritage archives world sometimes.
Somebody in one of the other presentations mentioned digital museums, and I know for Kate, a lot of your projects have gone there, and yeah, it's super cool in terms of like small collections or just working with people that don't think that they have an archive, but they have access to stories. They can make like a ready-made platform, or I think there's 3 levels of grants, and the biggest ones are, they're not nothing, they're pretty big. So, and with the small ones, you can help you get around kind of the lack of resources, lack of web expertise by using their templates and things like that. It's a good place to start. And once you've demonstrated success doing a certain project, it's much easier to keep a stone rolling than it is to start it from nothing.
Okay, we actually have a comment that threads really nicely onto the funding thing from Felicity, which is there's a lot of funding that's coming out of Digital Research Alliance of Canada for data management and advanced research computing. And this conversation about coordinating funding is coming up there too. So make friends with your research data management folks. So thank you, Felicity.
Thank you so much. You too. Thank you for being in the room. Thank you, Sarah.